Afternoon, everybody, and I just wanted to thank you all for being here and to wish you all a warm welcome to what is the fourth instalment of the 2024 Digital Cultures Research Centre Seminar Series. My name's Nick Triggs. I'm the Senior Research and Development Manager at the Research Centre. We see this series as a space for unpacking ideas, unlocking imagination, sparking conversations. It's a place where we share ongoing research from researchers at the centre with a wider audience. Just a quick reminder that today's talk is being recorded and so it will be accessible to everybody on the DCRC YouTube channel after the fact. Quick bit of background. We founded the Research Centre in 2009. It's an open and collaborative network. It works on inter and transdisciplinary research, on knowledge exchange and teaching, and our work connects issues at the heart of society, culture, creativity and technology, with a focus on people, on policy, place and practice. A quick date for your diaries in the future. The next event in this series is scheduled for Wednesday, September the 18th, same time at 1 o'clock. When we'll be hearing from Simon Morton, the Associate Professor of Creative Economies at UWE. But today, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Verity McIntosh, Associate Professor of Virtual and Extended Realities, and the project lead for the Arts and Humanities Research Council Immersive Arts Project, who today will be speaking to the risks and opportunities of the metaverse. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Verity.
Thank you, Nick. Hi, everybody. Really lovely to see so many people joining us in person, and hi to those of you who are joining later on YouTube. It's my absolute pleasure to be joining you from sort of the metaverse to start our talk today. I will be back in physical space with you in a moment, but I thought it would be a nice way to start to talk about this topic by joining you from an alpine lodge. I'm in a communal cafe in an app called Immersed. I'm wearing a virtual reality headset, and this is me sharing with you the beginning of this talk as my avatar to start to kind of share this conversation with you. So I guess, first of all, what are we even talking about with this slightly mad buzzwordy thing, metaverse? It means lots of different things to lots of different people. I'm going to share with you the four characteristics that I feel come up the most often in in these metaverse conversations, and we'll decide between us as to whether we think it's sort of here or not yet. One of the first sort of most resonant descriptions of what might be a metaverse is this idea that it's a spatial computing paradigm. It's a sort of 3D environment. It's a virtual space where you can kind of encounter the world as a 3D environment. I'm going to move my webcam about a bit if I can, just to sort of show you roughly where I am. So I'm in a cafe, as I mentioned. There's sort of a beautiful view across the Alps. There are other people working. I have my screens and your webcam that you're joining me through today. So it's a sort of spatial environment. I can move around within it, and it sort of has many of the characteristics of a 3D space. One of the other characteristics for a metaverse space is the idea that you feel embodied within that space. So me as an avatar, I'm able to kind of show up in this space as, in some way, a person. As I'm moving my head and my hands, my avatar's head and hands are moving, and pretty quickly I come to kind of psychologically associate my avatar and its movements with my own movements. And you potentially are starting to associate this avatar with me also, particularly as you may not have seen me in real life. So we are embodied, we show up as embodied people, we move as a little bit as humans do, although as you can see, it's still very early days with the graphics for that sort of thing. So it's spatial, it's embodied. Another of the characteristics is that the metaverse is imagined to be social, so not just myself, but any number of people could show up in this space. In fact, whilst I was waiting to join you, a bunch of people came and joined me, which was not the best timing, but part of the social dynamic of these spaces is that other people are here. It's effectively like they're in a cafe and they're working on their laptops, as am I, and we can interact with one another, we can speak in real time, we can swap ideas, we can sort of tag each other as friends and go and do more metaversey things in the future potentially, or they can ask me lots of questions about what I'm doing whilst I'm about to start a talk, all part of these social dynamics that we're experiencing today. And I guess the last characteristic that arguably isn't here yet, that comes up quite a lot, is this idea that metaverse spaces, and they are sort of multiple and plural, would be interoperable in some way. So traversable, interoperable. The idea is you'd be able to kind of move between them and take something of yourself with you, whether that's your avatar, your digital goods, your experience, your kind of cachet and expertise, that something of what I would do in this space would be applicable and transferable to other spaces. Arguably, that's not really available in most of these sort of dynamics at this point, and there are lots of people kind of working hard to establish standards and the underlying architecture that might make that possible. But arguably, that's not there yet, and so maybe the metaverse isn't here yet. So what we're talking about largely today is what we can learn from these sort of proto-metaverse spaces, like the one that I'm joining you from today, what they signal for us in terms of what might be coming and what we might need from each other and from our governing agencies and from multiple different stakeholders if we're going to kind of come up with a new technological frontier that feels helpful to us, that feels fair, that feels equitable. So at this point, not least as there's some people coming to chat to me again, I'm going to leave this place and join you with a very messy bit of hair in the real world. Hello. Hopefully you're still with me. So that was me in Immersed. This is me in my bedroom where I've been all the time, and there's something quite peculiar about the kind of the dual consciousness that you develop being a person in a physical space whilst also being a person in a virtual environment, and part of that, I guess, is what I'm interested in. So let me share something with you. This is hopefully quite an informal space, so forgive me if I'm tech wrangling half the time. It's part and parcel of being a person trying to work in this space. So, Nick or Amy, can you tell me, are you seeing my main screen or are you seeing my presenter notes?
Your main screen, no presenter notes.
Perfect, and also the cat who has also joined us in the physical world. Okay. So what I'm talking to you guys about today is picking up on a bit of the work that myself and others have been doing at the University of West of England in Bristol, looking at this idea of risks and opportunities of what might be a kind of coming metaverse. A lot of the amazing work that I've been fortunate enough to get involved with has been very much in close collaboration with a research partner, a woman called Catherine Allen, who runs Limina Immersive. She's the founder of that company and is a real kind of thought leader in this space about what's needed. So together, she and I have authored a number of reports. We've been writing for primarily agencies who are interested in the sort of the policy and governance side of the emerging technology paradigms. So we've worked with NSPCC, with Council of Europe, with various UK and international government bodies to try and better understand kind of what's needed from a policy level. We've been sort of speaking to various wooden-clad houses of power, including the House of Lords, House of Commons, EU Parliament, Council of Europe, over the last couple of years, trying to share what insight we can about the current states of play, sort of busting some myths, and also talking about what governments might be interested in doing in this space so that they can kind of take action on behalf of their citizens. So I guess some of the areas of risk and opportunity, just to give you a broad overview that we've been looking at together, kind of group into these 12 areas. Don't worry, I'm absolutely not going to walk you through 12 areas now. This is a lunchtime talk. You're hopefully eating your sandwiches and relaxing, and I'm not going to be kind of dragging you through 12 periods of research, but I will highlight a few of the ones that I think are particularly resonant for me at the moment, and it'd be really great to get your questions and conversations as we move towards the end of the talk. I'll try and keep this nice and sort of brief and overviewy, and if there are particular things that you want to dig in more in the ones that I highlight or the ones that I don't, then we can look at that together in the conversation towards the end. So I guess the first one that I thought I'd bring forward is this area of health and well-being that's been really, really prevalent in extended reality research over the last sort of decade or two. The virtual reality paradigms and metaverse contexts have been shown to have really unexpected amounts of distinct values in a number of healthcare contexts. There have been studies that have demonstrated it can be used in treatment of acute and chronic pain, treatment of PTSD and phobia through guided exposure therapy. There's been all sorts of ways of using these simulative technologies to train people, for example, surgeons and healthcare professionals, and to allow both healthcare professionals and patients to have a kind of a perspective-taking way of looking at what the patient experience can be. There's been some amazing research suggesting that people are more likely to follow physiotherapy and stroke recovery programs if they have a more kind of playful interface to allow them to do that in their own time, in their own home. And it can take a lot of that kind of outpatient sort of care programming out of the clinical context and into the home. So there's all sorts of ways in which health and well-being is being sort of is integrating with some of these new technologies and finding some positive ways to connect with patient-clinician relationships in different ways. I think, yeah, there's lots that we could say. I think there's lots of therapeutic and mood affecting applications that are being explored, which we're just starting to scratch the surface of. I think one of the areas that is of particular kind of commercial interest for a lot of companies right now is the idea of the working space becoming something that doesn't have to be as locked to a physical office or as kind of flattened as the sort of video conferencing call. As lovely as this is speaking to you this way, we all know that there are limits to the way that we can talk, we can collaborate, we can be with one another on Zoom calls, for example, whereas these metaverse contexts give us something a little bit back of that kind of physical relational dynamic. So we can interpret each other's body language, we can stand in relation to one another, we can share and collaborate with 3D objects and tools in what sort of feels like a more spatial environment. So it's a different way of working that in theory kind of marries some of the best things of home working with some of the best things of physical working. I think we know that there's some sort of enthusiasm about the idea that it opens up opportunity for a global workforce. You no longer have to be based in the same country as the company that you work for in the same way. There can be opportunities for people across the world. Someone talks about someone's been talking about the idea that you now hire in your time zone. You don't necessarily hire in your country or in your city. So there's sort of enthusiasm about what opportunity that gives and the democratization of the global workforce. There's also some quite sensible pushback about the fact that actually opportunity is only as great as your ability to have access to expensive hardware in home, to reliable internet and consistent data provision. So in fact, that kind of idea of a globalized workforce may well just evolve along the same sort of cycles of privilege and opportunity that already exist. If anything, they could exacerbate those cycles of privilege where technology becomes the access point to various different employment opportunities. So it's certainly not one thing or the other. There's also, I think, a real risk at the moment that because this sector has evolved from the existing kind of big 5 tech companies, and they hold a lot of the global monopoly in terms of hardware, software, platforms, opportunity, investment, content production, publishing, risk management. All of these things are held in very, very small numbers of hands. So the risk of corporate monopoly effectively kind of being sharpened in these metaverse contexts seems very high at the moment, and governments are having to really look at their corporate monopoly laws to understand how they apply in these immersive spaces if these are going to be new kind of working frontiers, and what rights workers may have to opt in and opt out of these kinds of paradigms. It's still very much an undisclosed or an unresolved question, should I say. Creativity is a really important part of this conversation. For me personally, I've sort of come from an arts and humanities background, working in theatre and across creative tech for some years. And I think one thing that I'm really encouraged and inspired by regularly is how artists, musicians, filmmakers, theatre makers, games designers have really embraced some of these tools and have made extraordinary works and continue to make extraordinary works with this, and often ask quite sort of difficult questions through the way that they embrace that creativity. I think we're seeing within that experimental space, there are new forms of storytelling emerging that are able to kind of really center the participants within a simulative or completely fictionalized environments that can give the participant agency in how that world operates or how that story evolves. There's been lots spoken about that we may have to stop saying storytelling and start talking about story doing or story living, because it's a much more kind of active and engaged sort of interactive space potentially to be inhabiting these kind of cinematic worlds or these fantastical worlds, if that's what we design for each other. Here at UE, we have a particular sort of heightened interest in these tools and technologies for the arts at the moment. We're leading a £6 million scheme called Immersive Arts over the next 3 years, which will be supporting more than 200 artists to develop their practice and to explore and engage with immersive technologies in different ways. So we're really excited to sort of see what comes through and how we can support the sector in a way that opens it up to a much broader community, that sort of champions these differences of opinion and difficulties and contentious issues, and the full range of what the arts can offer us in step with these emerging tools and technologies that have come from a more kind of Silicon Valley context. Hello, Kat. So these are our funders and partners. This is definitely not a talk about immersive arts, so I'm not going to sidebar it any further than that. But do feel free to get in touch if it's something you want to follow up on, or if you want to know a bit more about it in the chat afterwards, you're welcome to bring it forward. Back to opportunities and risks a little bit. I think this is a huge topic. And so again, I'm just going to slightly kind of pepper some ideas through this preliminary conversation, and then we can explore later. But I think a lot of the work that Catherine Allen and I have been doing particularly has been focusing on instances of sort of peer-to-peer harassment and abuse that has been shown time and again to be an endemic problem within these social virtual reality spaces and mixed reality spaces, where in these social spaces people are exposing one another to all kinds of racist language, homophobic language, transphobic language, simulated violence, simulated sexual activity, non-consensual touch. We've worked quite a bit with the IET and with the NSPCC to understand a little bit more about, for example, the prevalence of adults using these spaces to identify and groom vulnerable children, and the different categories of abuse that we're seeing being enacted in these spaces, to try and best understand what kind of empowering technologies and protection might be needed now. So yeah, we've been looking with policymakers at the appropriateness of existing laws, about the way that existing laws might apply, how things like kind of human rights can be understood in these virtual spaces. Is an avatar a person? This is a huge sort of existential crisis that we're having about what legal personhood means in these spaces when people are behaving in quite immediate ways with one another. What's the accountability there? One of the challenges, just to share quickly, that we're finding is that a lot of, especially in the UK and Europe, the laws are segmented into contact abuses, so implying physical unwanted touch, and content abuses, so where people are sharing or posting content that is deemed to be abusive. We don't really have a category for anything in between those. We're starting to refer to that as conduct abuses. So the behaviour that people enact in these spaces that is experienced as quite psychologically real and affecting and potentially traumatising can have some way of being understood in that context without being made equivalent to a physical contact abuse. So a number of legislators are looking into this question of conduct as a sort of a third category that might help law enforcement to support victims in this space. Data and privacy, another good old biggie. Here's our friend Mark Zuckerberg, and Mark Zuckerberg, his avatar. I think one of the challenges for anyone engaging with these tools and technologies now in any part of in any discipline, in any sector, is that they, as mentioned, they have been kind of brought to life in this particular iteration by large tech companies who've been really involved in the Web 2.0 kind of social media revolution. This is sort of Meta, Google, Microsoft, ByteDance, etc. And the business model behind those platforms, as we're now generally quite familiar, is that the user data is effectively the kind of the hidden economy of these spaces. If the service is free, you're the product. And the way that these companies make money is that they can glean a certain amount of information from the way that millions of users behave en masse that can then be really valuable to advertising, marketing, and others. I think it's not a stretch to suggest that their interest in this three-dimensional space, in this kind of metaverse space, is effectively the same. But there's an understanding that in these spatial paradigms, the information, the data, the personal information that can be gathered and interpreted is many orders of magnitude more valuable than screen-based media. When we are interacting with social media, there's a lot that can be told about us from who our friends are, what we click on, what we share, when we scroll, what we dwell on. That's all really valuable. But in these 3D environments, it's a much more detailed picture. We can now see who am I relating to? How do my pupils dilate when I encounter a particular person as next to another person? What do I say with my voice? What does people say back to me? What motivates me to do something or to buy something or to choose to stop doing something? This is all incredibly valuable, detailed, granular behavioral data that if enough people are kind of using these platforms becomes the sort of the salvation of these tech companies, because that's incredibly valuable. I think there's a huge unresolved question about how consent to give that data operates in these spaces. There are very opaque references to it in a lot of terms of service when you enter into these platforms. Different companies are doing it different ways, but effectively that same paradigm that is presumed from social media is coming into this one too, which is that if you're here, then your data belongs to us. And there's a real question as to whether governments need to take a stand or need to hold a position in relation to that. And particularly the EU has been really keen to offer an alternative to that and to protect people's ability to connect with these new tech platforms without automatically absenting all rights to their data and privacy. Some people would say it doesn't really matter, like, you know, you can have my data, it's okay, like that's the price that I'm prepared to pay. What you know, I'm not doing anything wrong, it's fine. It's worth noting, if that is a position that feels attractive, that that kind of granularity of data can also be used for quite personal identification measures, or at least they think it can. So various different studies have suggested that using very simple analysis of, for example, where someone's head is in relation to their hands, how they move, people can be personally identified very easily in these spaces. Our sort of biometric signature is very particular. And also some have suggested that using something as simple as tracking your eyes, you can infer personal circumstances, including gender, age, ethnicity, body weight, personality traits, drug consumption habits, emotional state, skills and abilities, fears, interests, and sexual preferences. You could very strongly argue that it doesn't, but I think the fact that it is being posited as something that could, and that might be a thing that would be a kind of saleable commodity without your ability to contest that, kind of ramps this up to a level that I think is really worth thinking about. So yeah, the idea that companies that effectively run a platform would have access to that level of granularity about who you are and what your life is like seems to be a next level of privacy. It's called a sort of biometric psychography, this idea that you might profile someone according to their kind of unconsciously contributed information. And actually there's been some really brilliant research and advocacy from a number of academics suggesting that it's time for what we call neurological rights. So the right to have mental privacy, the right for your internal monologue not to be available, and for those kind of biometric signatures not to be commodified. There's a principle called cognitive liberty that's sort of doing the rounds in legal space that is being applied to brain computer interfaces, neurotechnology, and so on. I'm going on a bit. I will try and keep it quick from here. I think like everything in every part of life at the moment, AI is creeping into the conversation, as well it should in this context. We know, of course, that these sort of metaverse technologies are growing up alongside their kind of cousin artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of integration in the way that they're being imagined together. So I think just as a sort of primer, some of the ways in which artificial intelligence works in these sort of spatial computing paradigms is that generative AI is imagined to play quite a large part in generating speech, text, images, environments, avatars, so sort of avatars that don't have a person that correlates to them, but that just kind of occupy a space and and have a function, and in iterating scenarios. I think this kind of approach, in combination with what we were saying about biometric psychography, is imagined to be useful because then you can kind of live customize an experience according to what you know about someone. I'm aware my neighbours are now drilling, so excuse me if I'm being accompanied by a drill in your audio. It's a lot. Another way that AI is showing up in these spaces is the idea of social metaverses at scale. It has a problem of moderation, like who can kind of keep an eye on these spaces. If we are going to address harassment, what kind of oversight could there be to sort of forestall behaviours or to report offences? And the answer that tends to come back is AI, that there would be some form of kind of AI supervision of spaces to monitor and moderate activity, whether that's looking at kind of age validation or the kind of flagging of legal and copyrighted content, similar to the way we're seeing social media AI integration now, but at a sort of a larger scale. And then the other question of AI is the idea that there might be behavioral modeling, so aggregating large-scale user data in order to kind of profile and predict and influence user behavior. There's a concern that that carries with it risks of large-scale social and political manipulation. You know, a lot of us are in an election cycle right now around the world, and there is concern, as there is across kind of web paradigms, that this kind of behavioural modelling based on this really enhanced understanding of what motivates people and how they are influenced and how they're influenceable could be mobilised at scale with metaverse and AI platforms. So what can we do? What can we see? I think one thing that I tend to come across a bit sort of miserable sometimes with these kinds of concerns, but I think it's really worth saying that nothing is yet inevitable in these spaces. It's a really pivotal moment, and it's great that governments are getting involved. It's great that tech companies are taking an interest in these questions, that users and citizens are sort of advocating for their rights more and more. I think the decisions that happen now really do affect what that kind of socio-technical future is. And so Catherine and I have occasionally tried to sort of pull apart what different types of futures might look like. And the first one that I think we find sort of emerges from the slightly sort of Silicon Valley attitude is this idea of sort of the high seas, like a fully decentralized libertarianism. The metaverse is a space that is deliberately outside of societal norms. There's no accountability to governments or to central banks. It's distributed, it's anonymous, it's kind of everyone for themselves. And it kind of contains within it this belief that that community is best sort of found, best navigated by the people who are most conversant in the technologies. The sort of the old guard or the elders of these spaces are the ones best able to kind of understand it and police it, and to kind of decide its future, and that it would be then quite resistant to external forms of oversight and accountability. Another possible future is what we're calling the surveillance state. So it's almost the inverse. That's where all activity is very tightly monitored and controlled, state level access to all activity all of the time. Any users who express a desire for anonymity or privacy would be treated with suspicion. We would have algorithm monitoring of voice and behaviour to identify undesirable behaviours and virtual transgressions. And virtual transgressions would then have real world consequences, because there's sort of this idea that behaviour in metaverse and behaviour in under state control are kind of synonymous. Another future that we think is quite heavily advocated for in certain circles is this idea of it being a profit palace, that it's a kind of business first environment where companies look to kind of try not to use the word colonize, buy up large percentages of this kind of metaverse space, host that space, use it to kind of further commercial imperatives, protect and exploit opportunities, create new profitable markets. In this version, we imagine that behavioral data from users would be understood to be the invisible currency of the spaces, made available to those who have effectively kind of bought it and own it, without needing explicit or informed consent from users. The data could be productized, allowing companies to personalize and target advertising, and to apply nudge psychology to kind of prolong or influence user behavior, both in and out of the metaverse. And then there's a sort of a fourth future that we, full disclosure, would quite like to wish into existence, which isn't those three, which is a metaverse in which human rights, democratic process, systems of justice and civil liberties are presumed to carry into the virtual space, that it is not somehow kind of imagined to be completely different, that one's rights, protections, freedoms, including the freedom to kind of protest and advocate for yourself, would be presumed to be carried through. In these digital worlds, freedom of expression coexist with governance and accountability. Clear, fair and equitable terms of engagement could enable companies to operate commercially and drive a culture of entrepreneurship and creativity, whilst citizen access is sort of negotiated on the principle that your data belongs to you. So this is a different kind of metaverse, one that does require a certain level of kind of civic level intervention to operate against the sort of capitalist model. It comes with all kinds of challenges about the fact that no two countries have the same approach to this, and so a per country approach to something that's imagined as a sort of a borderless environment are really challenging. Questions of jurisdiction and cultural disharmony are really rife within this tricky forum. But I think one of the things that we've been trying to start with is this idea that human rights are universal and ubiquitous, and that the fact that we're in a different technology framework shouldn't be presumed to negate that. So that's roughly where we're at the moment. And we're working with a bunch of amazing people around the world to try and understand this better and explore it further. And there's more work that we're doing now to try and move that forwards. But I think at this point I'm going to stop sharing, because I'd love to hear from you and to see if there are any thoughts, questions, things that you're working on that that connect in some way, or that we perhaps haven't been thinking about to this point. So at that point, over to you.
Thanks, Verity. That was really great and slightly terrifying. So just to reiterate that there's plenty of time for questions. Please feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and Amy will pick you up on those. But if anybody has a question, go ahead.
I think we've got one in the chat already from Mandy. Oh, Mandy's got multiple questions. Mandy said, this is fantastic, important. Also, I imagine daunting work that you and Catherine Allen have been doing. Thank you. The dominance of Silicon Valley players in this sphere is obviously concerning. I'm terrified at the thought of the density of personal information that can be gleaned, among other things. I'm curious about what alternative players and models might be emerging. You mentioned is that utopia? Can you say a little bit more about them and your thoughts on the potential for metaverse models outside of Silicon Valley, or does the idea of the metaverse rely on big tech players?
Thanks, Mandy. That's such a good question. I don't know, when I said you, I might have meant EU, and I was just being muttery. The EU is an interesting sort of family at the moment in this, because I think they are really primed for the conversation. They've just been through a huge sort of multi-year program of establishing various kind of different bits of legislation around digital rights and the way that GDPR kind of applies across different digital platforms. So they're really attentive to questions about data and privacy particularly, and are very keen that the GDPR model that has been sort of in place now for a while is sort of applicable here, and that the right instruments are in place to enforce it. There is quite a serious conversation going on in multiple parts of the EU about having what are they calling it, a Euroverse that is kind of all gardened specifically for European citizens, that operates outside of the influence and control of the tech companies. That's kind of what it would be for, and that it would be based on yeah, kind of principles of democracy and human rights. So, I mean, there's been some pretty weird early attempts to do stuff like that, where kind of Interpol like made a house in a metaverse platform and expected people to come to it, but didn't quite know why. So there's a little bit of a kind of the creation of ghost towns whilst people try and figure this out. But there is a sort of there are combined tracks. There are some places, for example, a lot of the conversations about what standards should be are happening across multiple companies, predominantly in the US, but also with a lot of partnership in Korea and Japan, to try and think about equitable standards that that kind of put the scaffolding in place for things like interoperability, but that also have a certain amount of kind of consumer protections as they would see them. The word consumer gets used a lot more than citizen outside of Europe. So there's like trying to work with the tech companies, there's trying to work against them, there is trying to influence the tech companies. I did a talk along these lines recently in Barcelona, and then was invited to go and kind of do the same talk again to one of the tech companies, and they, I think, often have kind of internal tensions about how much of this they're allowed to say internally, unless they have some sort of external grumpy woman telling them things out loud in public. So sometimes it can be quite helpful, I think, to give that grumpy perspective, because it lets them advocate internally. So there are different kind of places where these conversations are happening. I think one thing I find a little bit frustrating is that because it's still quite a weird, wacky technology, there's not much of this conversation happening in the public sphere. People don't really have much opportunity to gain their own frame of reference for it. Still, the majority of people won't have spent any time in what I'm calling kind of proto-metaverse spaces, so don't have any direct context for it. And it's often framed as this kind of sci-fi, faraway future tech thing. And I think what we found, particularly with the work with NSPCC, is that idea that it's a ways off yet and we don't have to worry about it can be really dangerous, because then it is being heavily used by tens of thousands of people all the time. And at the moment, that really does include a lot of very young people, like really young people for whom they've had access to the tools and technologies. Their parents perhaps, or their carers, don't perhaps know quite what it is that they're accessing, because you can't see it when somebody's in a headset particularly. And they're in these kind of open, unmoderated social environments that you would be unlikely to send a child of a younger age into in physical space, but are being kind of just sort of free-for-all spaces in these metaverse places. And time and again, we in our research, we were coming across some really troubling behaviours between adults and children, and some quite sort of cynical targeting of vulnerable people by criminal groups who are seeing this as a really kind of easy space to operate in, because there's no expectation of any oversight or scrutiny or accountability. So the fact that it to an extent, it already does exist. There's no public discourse about it, so there's no way that people are kind of advocating for difference. And so the risk, I think, at the moment is that all these decisions get made at whatever level they get made at, and the opportunity to call for something else comes too late. So hence why I'm being noisy about it, I guess. I feel like there are different opportunities to make change now, but we do need to be able to understand it better and talk about it, and have opinions about it, whatever they may be.
Thanks, Verity. That moves us on to another question where someone said, my children do not understand these spaces and issues. As a parent, I need tools for grasping these issues to begin to have these conversations with my children about this. Can you signpost me to anything?
Yes, I can. I will I'll give Amy and Nick some links that can go with the YouTube content. The 2 reports that Catherine and I wrote with the NSPCC were specifically looking at kind of existing risks, but also mitigation strategies. And part of that is a kind of a guide for parents as to what is useful to know, how you can approach these conversations with your kids. I think one of the things that I found really valuable talking to the NSPCC is that they don't really believe in just kind of like forbidding things. They feel like this is part of the technology landscape that children are growing up with and into, and will be part of their professional and social lives as they're older. And so kind of withholding these tools entirely until they're sort of 18 gives them a cliff edge that they then have to sort of fall off and figure it out as they go. So they talk really brilliantly about how you start to kind of scaffold these conversations, what are kind of more sort of, for example, starting very much understanding that there are experiences that don't have random members of the public in, that are very much kind of closer to what you might expect in a console gaming environment. So things that are about just your younger person being creative or experiencing a story or playing a game. There's advice there about how to kind of factor it into your family's screen time schedule. So like, how long is too long? What breaks do you need? What are the kind of risks involved of sort of coming in and out too abruptly? There's some really great advice out there. It's not always that easy to find. So happy to signpost after this.
Thanks, Verity. That'll be great. We've got another question from Amanda who says, thanks, Verity. Really interesting. You've covered a lot in a short time. I wondered how much the metaverse is being used as a tool for exploration / engagement at undergraduate level, given UE and other HE institutions is grappling with the rapid emergence and application of AI.
Yeah, good question. It's funny, actually. I think a lot of times I'm invited to go and talk about and say things and be on committees about how VR is used in education. And it's weirdly like probably the least expert that you'll find me. I tend to look at how these tools and technologies are kind of affecting different parts of kind of culture and society, looking at the political landscape, looking at legal frameworks. I don't actually do much with it as an educational tool. I have used it, I've taught for many years in different contexts, but possibly, with the exception of the first bit of the pandemic, the tools weren't really there, I found, to have meaningful teaching environments. They've got way better, and I've played with a few, but I actually don't tend to use it as a teaching tool so much as I teach about it, or I use it as an opportunity to explore different things. So yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone in the chat if you've got more experience of using it as a kind of virtual learning environment, for example. I think my talk today skewed a little bit VR-ish. It's also really worth noting that these kinds of metaverse contexts extend across kind of augmented and mixed reality environments more and more. That's what companies are kind of working towards, which is much more of it, rather than everything being a kind of you leave this place and you're suddenly in a big simulation. It's much more about retaining the view of where you are and bringing in digital augmented objects and environments and other avatars, kind of, so that you retain some sense of your physical environment. And I think that's definitely the sort of trend that we're seeing in this space. So don't let me skew you completely into this kind of fully immersive VR space. Didn't really answer the question, but we went somewhere else.
You did. No, thank you to everyone. There's lots of questions in the chat, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. We've got another one from Austin who says, are there any resources metaverse or communities can use to advocate for a democratic forum style of virtual environment, or even just as individuals, ways to push back when most XR tech is already gate-kept behind handing your data over?
That's a lovely thought. Yeah, I mean, sort of almost any one of those things that I spoke about kind of has a path, a sort of thread that you can tug on. If you want to explore, if you want to kind of speak more to this issue of harassment and abuse, there's some amazing institutions like the Centre for Countering Digital Hate and XR Safety Initiative. I think they've got a different security initiative, I think they're called now. XRSI, who are really strong at kind of, they're US based, and they often spend a lot of time kind of creating conversations that go directly to these larger tech companies. And they work across the world also. There's a few. There's if you want to look at, for example, the kind of the inequity in the digital divide, there are some great organizations who are talking about the sort of the right to access and the right to choose not to access. There's a few. I think you can, I mean, it sounds bad, but like just vote for who you like. I feel like I'm in that headspace at the moment. There are very differing views coming from different political parties around the world about how about the role of government, as to whether the government's job is to kind of support commercial development and shore up economic opportunity, or whether the role of government is to sort of prioritize citizen freedoms and protections. The advantage I've had, I guess, in working in the UK and in Europe and in the US a little bit recently is it really highlights those political differences, and those political differences make a big difference to how companies act and how citizens access information. So partly, yeah, good old-fashioned vote for who you think is going to best represent you in these conversations. Equally, I'm really happy to pick up conversations offline if people want to ask about specific areas or be signposted to particular advocacy organisations. There's there is a lot. Sometimes the challenge in this sector is that there are quite a lot of similar groups, and so sometimes just knowing who to talk to or where your voices can be the most useful at a given time is hard to navigate without support. So just start chatting to someone else who's similarly concerned and find a way through together, I guess. I'm trying to be the academic rather than like sort of the advocate, but those things are so heavily entwined at the moment. It feels silly not to recognize the positionality of academia. Academia is a really fortunate place to be right now, because I don't have to try and get a job in a tech company after this, unlike so yeah, I can be relatively straightforward in sharing what we're finding through the research. Obviously, everybody is massively influenced by their own experience and perspectives, but yeah, I think it feels more possible to talk about it from here than elsewhere at the moment.
Thanks, Verity. That's a really interesting point. We've got a comment from Caroline saying, fantastic overview, thanks so much. Within drama, we're keen to develop our understanding of metaverse performance possibilities, especially given the opportunities afforded by the writing of our new award, Drama, Acting and Performance. I'll certainly be following the Immersive Arts project and would love the opportunity to chat to you, Verity, given your theatre background.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, no, as you can probably tell, my happy place is when we get to talk about kind of arts and creativity and these as materials for supporting that kind of creativity. And I think we know that there's a massive kind of amount of understanding coming that we don't have yet about what performance for virtual space is. There were some amazing companies and platforms experimenting a bit with live performers performing into virtual spaces. Have a look at the Underpresents if you're curious, which is a really interesting place. And they had specific performances, for example, of The Tempest a few years ago, where actors who'd been effectively kind of stood down from Broadway because of pandemic situations were now performing into this kind of theatre show in a social VR platform game thing. And it was extraordinary to see the different affordances that these spaces give to actors, to audiences. You can kind of clothe an audience member as a character in the blink of an eye, and the same with a performer. And actually the ambiguity between who's a performer and who's not a performer was really fun. So there's a lot of play in play. I think for things like 360 video, which we haven't really spoken about at all, there's a real craft that we again haven't quite sort of got to grips with about how do you perform on camera when the camera doesn't have a front and a back. The camera is all around and is encapsulating the entire environment. How do you kind of perform in that space if you are trying to capture someone's attention, but they could just as easily be looking anywhere else but you. So what do you need to do to kind of hold someone through a story, or to kind of draw them across that sort of 360 plane? So there's lots of good questions, I think, for theatre, for performance, about how this kind of unbounded space is understood as a performance space. And there's lots we can take from immersive theatre and ambient theatre and site-specific works that kind of has clues for us there. But there's definitely lots that those who are learning now can open up and unlock together if they're starting to think about these as new stages.
I'll just jump in. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, I think we've got time for a couple more. So Leah says, brilliant talk, really important work. I was wondering if you have any more info on what constitutes personally identifiable data in metaverse spaces. Applying GDPR to spatial data is tricky because of the assumption is that head position or basic spatial data isn't personally identifiable. It seems like this is at least arguably incorrect. It would be great to know more about who is working on this and if there are ways to get involved in this research.
Thank you. Yeah. What have I just pressed that's made something go weird? Hang on. Let me find you again so that I can answer that question. Amy, am I showing people my weird notes? No, we're okay.
No, you're not.
Okay. So yeah, it's a huge question. I think for example, the one of the papers that I sort of flagged early on, and again, I'm happy to chuck these notes in there, was one from Stanford in 2020, which basically put a relatively small, a couple of hundred people into VR 360 videos. So we're not talking about fully kind of navigable spaces or social dynamics or any of that. It was just literally sort of stand here and watch this 360 video. And they found that with 95% degree of accuracy, they could look at only the head and the hand movements and tell you which person from that 200 it was, because we are very particular and we move in very particular ways. And even just like our height and where our hands are is really distinct to ourselves. So yeah, that kind of idea that you can't be identified by just the sort of the basics has been thrown into question. When you get into the fact that most of these particularly these social spaces use voice, your vocal signature is incredibly specific to you. So the idea that that wouldn't be a kind of an immediate fingerprint that is personally identifiable is again up for grabs. And then you get into this idea of biometric psychography, where there are so many data points around how your eyes, how far apart your eyes are, how they saccade when you're tired, how they move, how your pupils dilate. All of these things are part of your personal signature, and also saying something about how you respond to stimulus. So yeah, all of the sort of limited amounts of research that has been done in this space suggests that without ever having to log in with your Facebook account or provide your name, you are kind of implicitly providing a really identifiable signature. The way that different companies are currently kind of describing their policies is interesting. Meta's sort of terms of use say that that data is not currently being retained, but that they reserve the right to use it for advertising and commercial purposes and for training their own AI and for whatever it is that they want to do. They basically kind of withhold the right to use that data at a later point or to sell it to a third party. Whereas Apple's kind of terms of service for their Apple Vision Pro says that the gaze data, so the way that your eyes move, and any other implied biometric signatures will not leave the headset, so they couldn't get to it if they wanted to. And they are having some quite involved ways of describing their relationship to ChatGPT, for example, saying that they will have a kind of a particular server network that means that that individual data is atomized, so can't be used in consort to identify you. So it is already sort of slightly quietly becoming a bit of a battleground about the different ways that the tech companies are describing how they will use data that might make you personally identifiable and what right you have to retain that. And I had a rather sort of frank conversation with someone from one of those companies who said you kind of get what you pay for. So if it's free, that's not your prerogative. If you're paying through the nose, then you can expect privacy, and that is partly the culture. And if it follows only commercial pressures, then that will be the culture. And I think what we've found trying to kind of bring this issue to the attention of policymakers is that one of the few levers that we have in that is to put in regulatory frameworks that make it not okay, to kind of put in thresholds, like what can companies do and what can't they do, or what do they need to get explicit permission for, and can you consent to give away effectively unconscious data about yourself, or should there be a sort of a privacy threshold that is your brain? And that idea of cognitive liberty kind of comes back there about, what right does anyone have to infer something about the way that you're thinking? It's a whole vibe.
Thank you so much, Verity. We've got lots more comments and questions in the chat, but I don't think we're going to get time to go through them all today. So thank you everyone for contributing, and thank you, Verity, for a really, really interesting talk. I'm just going to hand over to Nick to wrap things up.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Verity. That was really fantastic. And thank you for being so generous with your time in answering all the questions. I know there are more. Please feel free to ping them on to us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so at dcrc@ue.ac.uk. I think that email address is also in the talk advertisement. Or feel free to drop in and visit us at our home in the Pervasive Media Studio, which is a diverse community of artists and practitioners working and exploring with creative technology. We're based in the Watershed on Bristol's Harbourside, and every Friday the studio hosts a public-facing lunchtime talk, and you're welcome to spend the afternoon with us. You can find out a bit more about the studio and about the research centre. That's enough for me. Just like to ask everybody to join me in expressing an abundance of thanks to Verity for this afternoon's talk, and see you in September. Thanks a lot.